Over the 2 days of February the 29th and March the 1st, the Yugoslav Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina held its own independence referendum. The republic was a patchwork of different ethnicities, the main three being Bosnian Muslims, nowadays known as Bosniaks, who represented about 43% of the population, Bosnian Serbs with about 31%, and Bosnian Croats with 17%, plus a little over 5% who described themselves simply as Yugoslavs. Broadly, the Bosniaks and Croats were in favour of independence, but in anticipation of the referendum, a large chunk of majority Serb areas had already declared their own state of Republika Srpska and sought either independence or union with Serbia. With the Republika Srpska officially boycotting the referendum and encouraging ethnic Serbs living in other areas to do the same, the result was a huge majority in favour, and a couple of days later independence was declared with Bosniak Alija Izetbegovic as president, but already there was violence as a shooting in the capital Sarajevo took the lives of the bride and priest at a Serbian Orthodox wedding. Secretly, President Slobodan Milosevic of Serbia had issued orders to the Yugoslav National Army to release all officers and men of Bosnian Serb birth and transfer them to a new Bosnian Serb militia, which was liberally armed with former Federal Army equipment. James Baker, the US Foreign Secretary, urged the US and the newly renamed EU to recognise Bosnian independence, but it seemed that a repeat of the Croatian War was inevitable. And in South Africa, the small port of Walvis Bay was transferred to Namibia 2 years after she gained her independence. Namibia had been a former German colony until the end of World War I, then held as a mandate by South Africa, but Walvis Bay as a former Dutch colony had ended up part of South Africa proper. While Namibia was under South African rule, it didn't really matter, but the little port was of no real use once geographically isolated and was handed over. The return of sport and lifting of most economic and political sanctions against South Africa recognised the enormous progress the country had made in getting rid of the hated system of apartheid, but there was one last major hurdle to overcome. In order to extend voting rights to people of all races, the constitution would have to be amended. This in turn required a referendum, which of course under the current law could only be voted on by whites. The referendum had been scheduled for the 17th of March, a little over 2 weeks after the Grand Prix. With government control of TV and other media left over from the bad old days, and support for yes from around the world, things looked good, but nothing was certain as yet. And this is as good a time as any to mention that the South African flag I've used for the title screen and thumbnail is not the one that is historically correct for the time of the race, but is the current one adopted in 1994. The correct historic flag for 1992, just as with the earlier 1980s races, is the orange, white, blue tricolour with the little flags in the middle, but this is now officially banned as a hate symbol in South Africa itself. I don't know if I have any South African viewers. If I do, hello. But while I think it's fine to use in an educational context like this, I don't want any SA viewers getting in trouble, and to be honest, I don't really want hate symbols on my channel thumbnails. Anyway, 8 of the current field of F1 drivers had driven the last race at Kyalami in 1985. Senna and Berger, Mansell and Patrese, Alboreto, Brundle, Martini and Boutsen, but they would have no advantage from the experience as the track had changed beyond all recognition in the interim. Most of the old circuit was gone, sold for redevelopment, with only a section from the old Yuksky sweep through Sunset, Clubhouse and the S's still present. The long, fast section from Leeuwkot through the Kink to Crowthorne was gone, replaced by a narrow, twisty section that transformed Kyalami from one of the fastest circuits in the world into one of the slowest and most technical. Like Monaco without the walls was one less than charitable comment, though there was universal agreement that the pit and paddock facilities were top-notch, and there was a huge and enthusiastic crowd, many of whom were supporting Nigel Mansell. The circuit was plastered with the branding of Yellow Pages, the State Post Office's telephone directory, which had almost exactly the same branding and logo in the UK at the time, oddly, and most of the corners were named after sponsors too to help pay for the whole affair. In order, Total, Nashua, Budget, Yellow Pages, the Top Sport, S's, Westbank and Continental, with only the name of the Kink and the unnamed Turn 13 onto the main straight surviving from the old track. 2 familiarisation sessions were planned on Thursday the 27th of February, and everyone had a go, the dusty surface and unfamiliar corners catching quite a few out, but afterwards Andrea Sassetti had a note from the FIA officials. The Andrea Moda team hadn't paid their $100,000 new team bond, and therefore wouldn't be allowed to take part. Sassetti responded that they weren't a new team, they were a renamed Coloni, just the same way as Footwork, Fonmetal and others had done before. There was an exchange of paperwork, the net result of which was that no, Sassetti had bought the assets of the Kyalami team but not their entry, and as such were regarded as a new team and would have to pay the bond. With no other option, Andrea Moda packed up and went home, Sassetti fuming about what he saw as Bernie Ecclestone conspiring to make life difficult for a small non-British team. That meant the entry was down to 30 cars, which meant pre-qualifying was cancelled and everyone got a lie in. Mansell, the winner here in 1985, was fastest both days by quite a margin, with only Senna getting within a second of him. Berger in third was 1.2 seconds behind, Patrese 1.5 and Alesi 1.7. Everyone else, led by Schumacher in sixth, was over 2 seconds off the pace. Schumacher's Mercedes teammate Wendlinger did a fantastic job to put the underfunded March, which hadn't turned a wheel all winter, 7th, lining up alongside Brundle's second Benetton. Capelli began his Ferrari career from a slightly disappointing 9th. The Tyrrells were 10th and 12th, sandwiching Herbert's Lotus. The Ligiers were also well up in 13th and 14th, Tarquini 15th and the Fonmetal, then the Footwork 16th and 17th. The Dallaras, on the other hand, had an awful qualifying. The car was handling very poorly. They both qualified, but only just in 24th and 25th, while the usually rapid Hakkinen couldn't get his gear ratios right and was languishing back in 21st. Last up was Eric van der Poel, making just his second Grand Prix start in the Brabham. But nobody had a bigger come-down from 1991 than Jordan, for whom Gugelmin managed 23rd and Modena was 29th and would not be racing, over 6 seconds off the pace. The perpetually glum Stefano would be joined by 3 of the new drivers, Paul Belmondo, Andrea Chiesa and Giovanna Amati, which meant that every team would have at least one car in the race, which was nice. The other 2 debutants were Ukio Katayama in 18th and Christian Fittipaldi 20th. So with long faces in the Jordan and Scuderia Italia pits, lack of engine grunt and lack of handling and downforce respectively seemed to be the problems, and Mansell's race car developing an electronic fault that couldn't be traced all night, the clouds gathered on Sunday morning with a very real chance of a wet start to the season. Goodyear had supplied the same harder compound to everyone and was confident that no tyre stops would be needed. Senna was downbeat about his chances until the arrival of the new car, while Mansell had been working hard on his fitness all winter and weighed in for the start of the season lighter than Patrese for the first time. Everyone was saying that this was finally Mansell's year. But we'd soon find out, because on Sunday the 1st of March, an unusually early start to the season by recent standards, it was time for the cars to line up and the talking to be drowned out by the sound of 26 screaming V8, V10 and V12 engines. By the time everyone had lined up, the skies were looking distinctly less threatening and a dry race was expected. The lights went green and away they went for the 1992 season, with Mansell getting away well and Patrese going very well to thread between the 2 McLarens and take second, that traction control system proving its worth in its first outing. Berger, meanwhile, had dropped to 5th behind Alesi. As they rounded lap 1, Senna was all over the back of Patrese, while Mansell motored away into the distance, and Berger dropped another place to Schumacher. Further back there was a bit of bumping and banging on the unfamiliar track, with Brundle and Wendlinger coming together, spinning the Benetton round while De Cesaris took to the gravel to avoid them. Brundle booted it round and restarted, but burned his clutch out in the process and pulled off on the second lap, unable to select gears. The first retirement of the new season and a disappointing start to his Benetton career. Senna had dropped away from Patrese now and was being hounded by Alesi and Schumacher, with Berger and Capelli just behind, while Mansell was now already nearly 5 seconds in the lead. Berger was having a recurrence of an old McLaren problem. His fuel gauge was playing up, and he wasn't sure how much he was using, so he'd eased back to conserve fuel, allowing Alesi and Schumacher to pull away a bit. Wendlinger's car had been damaged by his collision with Brundle, and after dropping back he pulled off with an overheating Ilmor. Having a better day so far was Johnny Herbert in the 1989 vintage Lotus, who was hanging on to 8th place and running in the wheel tracks of Capelli, who was in turn trying to pass Berger. The 2 Ligiers were just behind Herbert too, also enjoying an upswing in form. The leaders lapped the first of the backmarkers in the shape of Van der Poel's Brabham on lap 24, just as Tarquini pulled over with no oil pressure. The Alesi Schumacher-Berger Capelli scrap, now pulling away from Herbert, was the best viewing on track at this point, as Senna forlornly chased the Williamses, at least until Ivan Capelli's Ferrari debut came to a premature end on lap 29, with a seized engine, his oil pump suddenly losing pressure. Another Italian, De Cesaris, was having a good race, making up for his early excursion by disposing of his teammate Guiar, then Fittipaldi, Tarquini before he stopped, and Alboreto, and had now taken up position behind the 2 Ligiers. Guiar, for his part, was leading Martini and Suzuki, but was so busy scrapping with them that he nearly took out Mansell as he lapped him. Nigel, who had previous with Olivier, was not a happy bunny. Half-distance came and went, and with little change at the front end, as Japanese rookie Katayama had a spin and headed in for new boots. Patrese was held up a bit getting through traffic, and by the time he was waved through by 16th place Mika Hakkinen, Senna was much closer. Senna was always great through traffic, and with the target in sight he was driving out of his skin. It was Alesi's turn to have an engine go bang on lap 41, ending the new Ferrari's debut with exactly the same problem Capelli had had, and while Senna continued to chase Patrese, that meant Schumacher had moved up to 4th, Berger to 5th, and Johnny Herbert to 6th, still chased hard by Comas and Boutsen. Alesi was the first of a flurry of retirements, followed by De Cesaris, who'd overtaxed the Zilmore engine on his great run through the field. Then Christian Fittipaldi, whose alternator gave out, and JJ Leto with a gearbox failure. Murray Walker had predicted before the race that the gruelling nature of the circuit plus the unfamiliarity and early season nerves would see maybe 11 cars finish the race, and with a third of the race to go we were down to 17 already. The last 15 laps or so were fairly uneventful in the end, except for the trickle of retirements, Morbidelli, Martini, Boutsen and Guiar, as Patrese kept the gap to Senna without too much trouble. And so Nigel Mansell sailed home to take the win in his second successive South African Grand Prix, 7 years after the last one, with Riccardo Patrese following him 24.3 seconds behind, and Senna 10 seconds behind him in third, having eased off quite a lot at the end. With Schumacher, Berger and Herbert taking the remainder of the points, the top 6 at the end of lap 72 were the same as they'd been on lap 44, but only just though, as Berger pulled over out of fuel as soon as he crossed the line. Mansell's victory was a popular one in South Africa, where he was a big fan favourite, and the Williams teams would be delighted with 16 points and a display of total domination, even if the viewing public had been largely bored to tears. Comas was pretty pleased with 7th place, having hardly sat in the car before the weekend, but was somewhat crestfallen when Guy Ligier reported that Prost would have finished it in the points. He was still hoping against hope that Alain would change his mind, and Le Professeur had said he would make a final decision by the 16th of March, though Jean-Marie Balestre opined in L'Equipe that Prost would make a fool of himself by driving a Ligier. Suzuki, Gugelmin, Katayama and Van der Poel all finished their first races, or first races for their new teams at least, with Hakkinen completing the race in 9th, never having really recovered from his awful qualifying. There was now a 3-week gap before the next race in Mexico for everyone to digest the lessons of Kyalami, and there was still an outside chance that Prost would be driving a Ligier in Mexico.